State Representative Jenny Graham from Spokane, 6th District, and I am here with Melanie Roberts to talk about her grandmother, Ruth, who was the unfortunate victim of a carjacking and was tragically killed. This woman was a lovely lady, a dog walker, and an absolutely outstanding grandmother from what I'm learning about her. We're going to take this time to help you learn who Ruth was and what happened in this situation that is very relevant to the laws that we are considering, not only this session, but sessions past. So with that, Melanie, would you like to talk to us about your grandma Ruth?
Yes, I would. My grandmother was 80 years old when she was killed. She was killed on August 20th of 2024 by an 8-time felon who should have already had 3 strikes. His 3rd strike was amended, and he served time and was released and got back out on the streets to kill my grandmother. She was sitting in a car on the side of the road with 5 dogs. She was a dog walker, and she was sending daily devotionals to her friends, scrolling on the phone like all of us do. This man walked past her car 5 times, checking to see if the dogs were going to react before he decided to open the car door, passenger side, basically pushed her out of her own vehicle and ran her over, killing her in the process. He then evaded and went to a park where he took one dog out and stabbed the dog to death, which is an animal cruelty. I should probably back up. I missed something there. Sorry, guys. People tried to intervene to help my grandmother, and he put a knife in their face, which made another assault charge for him. He's currently being held on 1st-degree murder, 2nd-degree assault, and animal cruelty. My grandmother had been a pillar in her community, a beloved dog walker for 35 years, someone who served her community, served the Lord, and was very family-oriented. And she was taken from us because the justice system failed her. They let her kill her out on the streets instead of protecting her as a citizen of the state.
So, feeling that pain, because I know that kind of pain, what is your feeling based on, what you know about this case, the things that you've learned about the individual, Jamed James? What is your understanding of when we talk about he should not have been out, when he shouldn't have been let out? What brings you to that thought?
So Jamed Haynes, he had a prior conviction for vehicular homicide in the 90s. He had a conviction for drug charges, other felonies not strike related. He had aggravated armed robbery. That was his 2nd strike. He was serving time in the Monroe prison, and he assaulted 2 Department of Corrections officers. He tried to kill them with a shank that he made. My thought here is, if armed, trained prison guards are not safe from this man who is being forcibly medicated for, yes, probably some valid mental health issues, then how is the general public safe? Yet the prosecution decided to give him a plea deal that amended what would have been his 3rd strike down to some assault charges. He served some time when he got out. My frustration comes from the fact that had they stuck to their guns and kept the assault 2 charges for trying to kill a Department of Corrections officer while in prison. If they would have kept those charges, he would still be in prison and he wouldn't have been out on the street to ever commit any crime. So to me, the judicial system failed her there. Every time this man has jaywalked or lifted a piece of gum from a corner store since he was released, that's on them. My grandmother would still be alive if 3 strikes was properly followed.
So, looking into this a little bit deeper, am I correct in what my understanding is, that he was already convicted of another death before this happened to your grandma? Would you like to talk about that a little more?
Yes, ma'am. So I believe it was in 1993. He was driving a car on the sidewalk, hit a person. I'm not sure if he was in a vehicle, exiting the vehicle, walking. I don't know the exact details, but he was thrown 50 plus feet and he was killed. Jamed jumped in a cab and told him to take him to a facility to evade arrest or to evade consequence. I'm not sure, but that was the first person he killed. And he got an absolute slap in the face judgment, and I think he only served 3 years for taking a person's life. So that was the first family he impacted.
Right. And so concerning the different things that I read about trying to learn a little bit more about Mr. Haynes, he was also convicted of other violent crimes, robbery, and other and see, that was one of the other things that I noticed, that when we were talking, you had frustration that how can he have 8 felonies and not already be in prison on 3 strikes? And in looking at trying to find the answer to that question, some of these felonies were considered to be nonviolent or property crimes. And when we're talking about nonviolent property crimes, one of the things that comes to my mind is what happened with your grandmother. She was sitting in her car, minding her own business, taking care of the dogs, and that was also my understanding, that your grandmother basically died trying to protect those dogs.
She did.
So, that she obviously was a fighter. I am definitely garnering that from any of the information that I've read about your mom, was that, she would have definitely been fighting to protect those dogs. And when I think about what your family is going to face in Washington State, prior to running for this position of state representative, like your family, I had already been going through a similar process involving the murder of my sister, and recognizing and having a hard time trying to reconcile why it seemed like there was more emphasis placed on protecting the murderer of my sister and so many other people than actually standing up for the victims, which was hard, to try for any victim's family member or loved one to try to wrap their head around this. And that's kind of what I was looking at coming here with so many questions. Why did this happen, and why hasn't somebody done something to stop this situation that now your family is unfortunately going through in the justice system, where when you have a crime like this, unfortunately, you haven't been through the court yet, right?
We went through a capacity hearing and we've gone through arraignment, and that is as far as my grandmother's case has gotten currently.
Right. So when it comes to resources for you, for your family, the the alleged or the accused person, they have access to an attorney. They have access to all kinds of rights that are there to make sure, that obviously we don't want to get somebody convicted that's innocent, but it's just as important to make sure that we're not letting somebody that's guilty walk free either, which happens way more than the other way around. But I think what was really striking for me was learning that not only do you not have any legal representation, because the prosecutor represents the interest of the state, and that also comes down to the plea bargains, because we don't get to necessarily decide what happens with that. And I think you and I were talking about this before, and you had mentioned that you had no idea why there was a plea bargain regarding the correctional officers that were attacked. So you still don't have answers for why these officers were so viciously attacked at a facility. You still don't know why there was a plea bargain taken that allowed this man to walk free to kill your grandmother. Is that correct?
Right. I don't know why they pled it down. In fact, to me, it's insane that they did. This man attacked armed, trained prison guards while in custody and while being medicated. The evaluator questioned his mental capacity to understand charges against him at that time. So he was sent to Western State Hospital for, they call it restoration therapy, for 3 months to try to restore his capacity. While there, Western said he has capacity. He understands. He was able to name every part of basically the judicial system, from the judge to the jury to the prosecutor, to his defense attorney. He understood what the pleas meant. He even admitted in that case of the attack of the officers that he planned it for a week. He took a chair leg and sharpened it for a week, a metal leg, to a 12-inch shank. He planned the next time they came into his cell that he was going to attack this guard. He knew that it would probably mean his third strike. He knew that that third strike meant life in prison. He knew all of these things, and he still carried out that plan, that premeditated plan of attack on an armed, trained professional. And yet he was given a plea deal to serve time and get out and to be in the society that you and I walk in.
Right. So you're making a good point that this individual clearly had no fear of the prison corrections officers about attacking them in that setting where there were likely cameras that could have caught the attack while it was happening. So if that's the case, why would he be worried about attacking an individual out in our community if he were given the chance, which clearly he did? And that brings me back to Washington State has crime victims' Bill of Rights. And the thing that I keep coming back to with that when I consider those Bill of Rights is not only are they not being respected, they're not being implemented. And when it comes to trying to help the person that is actually on the receiving end of that crime that's committed against them, there's no real resources to help that person get back up on their feet. Because obviously in your situation, there's costs that come into it. If you were a victim and you had to go to the hospital or something along those lines, it's the victim that has to pay for that. In the case of a homicide, like our family, my parents were faced with having to bury my sister, and that is a cost that not a lot of people are prepared to have to pay. I recently spoke with somebody whose son was murdered in a drive-by shooting, and she mentioned that the funeral cost $20,000 that their family had to pay for, and this is a poor family. So there's no resources then, to help families like yours. What's your thought on that?
Well, there is a small resource that I wasn't even aware of. I believe it goes through Labor and Industries. They contacted me as being a very vocal family member and her representative. They reimburse you up into, I want to say it was around $7,000. I'd have to check records, but they do reimburse. Or if you find a funeral home that's willing to wait for payment and get paid directly, and that's how I was able to take care of my grandmother, her ashes and a celebration of life. It covered a portion of it, not as you said, $20,000 is what the other people paid, and all in all, probably about that much too. It helped, but no, it was still an out-of-pocket expense.
Right. And that Crime Victims Compensation Fund is knowingly always short of money, which was kind of one of the other things that I was considering in a goal to try to put together a crime victims ombudsman at the state level, so that would give families like your family or other family a place to go if they felt maybe they weren't being treated fairly in the justice system, or to maybe help them connect with resources that might be available that they may not know are there. And again, that a lot of times is dependent on, is there funding for it or not. So I am happy to hear that your family was able to get a little bit of help, because there's a lot of families that don't.
Right. And I think it probably was because this case was so well reported. Okay. That's, I believe, a reason why we were lucky enough to get some funding. But if we're talking a small town and a small, there's no small murder, but a not televised, not media sensation event, I don't know how other families would get these funds. And you're right. How would they even know to ask for them if there's not someone to help direct families? How would you know? How would you know you were even eligible, or if there was money there to help you? I believe if her story hadn't have been broadcast around the world like it was, I'm sure nobody would have reached out to me saying, hey, this is available to help you. So I, in that case, was fortunate enough to have the assistance, but that's the rare case.
So I have another question for you. There's different legislation that has been coming through the legislature that one of the bills specifically talks about allowing judges to dismiss misdemeanor crimes without going through a prosecutor. So these judges would be able to just decide whether to dismiss that case or not. And there was a judge that actually testified last session, it was, in favor of that bill, and made the comment that we don't need to include crime victims because it's too traumatic for them to be involved. So we don't need to include them in this decision that's being made. How do you feel about that?
If your kid got in trouble at school and the principal decided to unilaterally suspend them without hearing from your child or you as a parent, and there were other circumstances that needed to be considered, how would that make you feel as a parent? we don't get the chance to speak to these judges and tell our sides of the story and how it impacts us, how can they really get the full scope of how what they think is a little misdemeanor has impacted our lives? Judges there's a judge and a jury for a reason. There's some separation there. That's what our Constitution says, is that we need the person is not guilty until found guilty, but by a jury of their peers. A judge is not their peer. A judge is there to oversee a prosecutor and a defense attorney, and the jury, unless it's a bench trial, that's the only time a judge should be making a unilateral decision on guilt or innocence, but it's based on evidence supplied and provided and argued. Judges are not the say-all, the know-all, the do-all. There needs to be an order to this.
So how do you feel about there's been something that has been popping up in the news more and more, where there are either judges or prosecutors that make a decision, and if something goes sideways, for all intents purposes, they have what you would call absolute immunity, that if they make a decision, they let somebody out early or don't decide not to charge them with something, and then a family ends up having one of their family members or loved ones hurt or killed. Do you think, or do you support the judges or the prosecutor having absolute immunity for any sort of accountability at all?
Absolutely not. They're making a decision that's putting the rest of us at risk. In my grandmother's case, this prosecutor out of Snohomish County decided to forego all the information that said this man was a violent danger to people and amend charges, and thought, oh, he'll serve 15 years and everything will be okay. I'm going to make that decision and enter this plea deal. And look what happened. 7 years later, and I realize it wasn't the next day or the next week or even the next year. Doesn't matter the amount of time. Her decision to plead him out allowed him out of prison, allowed him on the streets, and allowed him to kill my grandmother. I absolutely think that they should be held to some kind of standard. What if it was her grandma that got killed, or her daughter that got killed? How would she feel then about making a plea deal that allowed this person freedom, that allowed the rest of us to be in jeopardy?
So this is a good segue to talk about one of the issues that, I've really been trying to wrap my head around what's been going on with the justice system in Washington State. It seems upside down, backwards, inside out. And I surprisingly came up with the term, it's called the Washington Way through DOC. And that is something that just kind of, I Googled it one day just to, I'd heard about this from people that were in the corrections industry. And I was surprised that it actually did pop up, that this is actually a thing in Washington State. And this comes from the system in Norway, which was something that I kept hearing in the Public Safety Committee, where the chair would talk about, we want to be more like Norway. And I was just kind of like, what does that mean? What does that mean? But they never mentioned the phrase, the Washington Way. And when I looked into that, the gist of what it says is that when a person commits a crime, like what you're talking about, or crimes, that their punishment is going to court. And then from there, they go to prison to learn to be a good neighbor. Do you have any thoughts on that?
To me, that's the complete wrong way. you are rewarding offenders by letting them off the hook. We'll go back to the child and the parent. Is being called to the principal's office the punishment? No, it's the accountability. Your punishment is what comes afterwards. If you're suspended or expelled, that's your punishment. So going to court is to determine if you are guilty or innocent, and then you are sentenced. And prison is your consequence. It is your punishment. It is your sentence. You're not there to learn how to be a good neighbor. You're there because you did something wrong. I don't get the hand-holding. Nobody is going to... If there's no consequence, nobody's going to stop doing it. If I go to prison and they're going to give me 3 meals a day and I have a roof over my head and they're going to teach me how to interview better and get a job when I get out, rehabilitation's a great thing to a point. But if you are a repeat offender, violent repeat offender, I don't want your hand held. I want it slapped. I want you to pay for what you have done. I want the rest of us to be safe. And for victims, for me, for my family, for other victims, the Washington way is the wrong way.
So there was a point where we were in a committee and there was an individual that made the comment that when they committed a crime against somebody else in the community, that their punishment was being away from their family, which I found pretty interesting that he didn't mention the other side of it. If it's a situation like yours, what about your family in that situation where your loved one's never coming home again?
There's an oldie but a goodie, do the crime, you pay, do the crime, pay the time. They think their punishment is being away from their family for a sentence, even if it's life in prison, that's their sentence, that's their punishment. My grandmother was sitting in her car, and I will never see her again. That is a punishment. It's a punishment for my family, for my 10-year-old daughter. It's a punishment that my grandmother never got to enjoy retirement. She was still working at 80 years old by choice. We have been punished. Offenders, I'm sorry if they don't get to spend time with their family. I'll never get to spend time with my family again. She's gone. Consequences build good people. If you are running around, running amok as a kid and you get in trouble, you're going to learn from that punishment that you get. If you're grounded, learn from it. Don't do it again. If you're a criminal, you get caught, what are you going to learn if you're released with no consequence? I'm going to go do it again. It doesn't match. The punishment needs to match the act. And I'm sorry, but you do a crime and you get punished for it by going to prison, you forfeit your right to your family. If I can't have my family, you definitely can't have yours.
So if you had the ability to change anything in our justice system under the Washington, which is under the Washington way right now, which I guess is fair to point out that, did anybody ask you if you wanted Norway's justice system? Did you get to vote on that?
Never heard of it. Never heard of the Washington way. Never heard of the Norway way. Never heard of any of that. What I had heard of was 3 strikes and you're out. But even that, people are finding a way around pleading down something that should be a 3rd strike, that should protect us. That bill that law was implemented to protect people from multiple time violent offenders. That, I'm pretty sure, was voted on. But yet it's being skirted now by a Washington way.
So if you could change anything in the justice system for crime victims, what would that look like for you?
For crime victims, I would say having access to the support that you're talking about, having access to resources to help with funeral or counseling if they need it, or I don't know if it's a financial thing long term, but resources in general, case by case. Every case is different. There's no two crimes that are going to be the same. There's no two families that are going to be impacted the same. So a resource to help with that would be amazing for victims' families. Personally, I'd like to see employers support victims' families a little bit more. If you need time away from work because your family member was murdered, for instance, that's not something that, a 3-day bereavement's going to help. That's not something that's going to be covered under a 3-day time. I'd like to see some more support for family members in that way too.
So, do you have any other thoughts on your mind that you would want anybody that's watching this video to know?
I would really like to get back to the fundamentals of the 3 strikes law, which is not just felonies, it is violent felonies against others. If someone hasn't learned after 2 violent felonies against others and they commit a 3rd violent felony against others, I don't want there to be any negotiation. I don't want there to be any other plea deal. If you can't learn, if you have not learned to reintegrate yourself into society after the 3rd time, please protect the rest of the Washingtonians in this state. Please protect the rest of the families. I feel like judges, prosecutors, legislature, they need to look at themselves and challenge themselves to protect the rest of us and give us the same thought and care that they are giving the criminals who are hurting us.
So you're advocating for compassion and empathy for the crime victims and their loved ones.
If they're already giving it to the criminals, the victims need it more. I feel like Washington State has a duty to protect us. They have a duty for me to be able to walk down a street or sit in my car, scrolling on my phone like all of us do. They have a duty to protect people walking dogs. They have a duty to protect people in a grocery store, anywhere. The good outweigh the bad, but all of the focus, all of the attention, all of the compassion and care is directed at the bad. We need to be protected.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to being able to work with you in the future, where we stay connected about different bills that are coming up and hopefully grow the amount of people that have been, for lack of a better term, justice involved, because we hear that when they talk about the incarcerated, the term is justice involved. I would argue that victims and their family members, their loved ones, are also justice involved, and they should have an equal seat at the table with a voice that should be respected and heard and considered when different legislation is being debated and considered at the people's house of all places. So I thank you so much for finding the courage to talk about this very painful experience that, that's affecting your family. It's a life sentence. And that is unfortunate. I'm happy to see that you are being able to find that inner strength and use that to advocate for other families not to hopefully have something happen to their family like what's happened to yours. I hope you're able to find strength and healing in that, and I know that your grandma would be very proud of you.
Thank you. As horrible as this whole situation has been, I know that my family and I know my grandmother would want to be a reason that some change happens. If we can use her tragedy to make a better state here, she would be all for that. And it's not exploiting the situation. It's trying to protect somebody else from going through this too. And it is a life sentence. And some people might say, oh, she was 80, she was old. Her mom was 99 when she died. Her mom's mom was 94. I should have had 15 years left with her. My daughter should have had 15 years left with her. It's not a matter of age. It's not her life sentence. It's our life sentence that we will be missing her forever. And I want some good to come of what happened. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to try to make that happen.
Well, we are definitely going to work on that together. Thank you.